Babylonian captivity in the background. And let me make sure I'm recording. I'm recording. Sound. Okay, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask or type it in. And kind of briefly, we're going over the events just before or during the Renaissance. You could argue the Renaissance was beginning right here. And the big thing in the Renaissance will be, or why this Renaissance is different than the medieval Renaissance I talked about before, the 1200s, before the plague, is this will be a radically different way of thinking. And so we're just setting it up right now. So talked about how a little bit of the Battle of Agincourt, and looked like the English were going to win a big victory, but then Joan of Arc helped turn the tide, and the English would end up losing the 100 Years' War, the War of the Roses between the Lancasters and the Yorks. A very confusing battle. I was going through, I was like, God, I can't get into all these different fighting and things. So basically the point that happened, it looked like the Yorkists had won, and they put the brutal Edward IV on the throne, but he died suddenly, and Edward V would come in. And I believe I showed you, let me go back here, the famous portrait of the two princes. Edward's brother, Richard III, took power, had them both murdered almost certainly. And this angered everybody. That led to a Lancastrian victory, even though it was more complex than that, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. And that's where we get Henry Tudor, Henry VIII's father. And I just thought this was amazing, the bones here. And yeah, we're not sure what it is. Some of you and a couple of people did mention scoliosis, and it's almost certainly related to that, but it's something like that, but it's very severe form of it. So it's a pretty amazing find. It's one of those wow moments. Oops, give me a sec.
Do you think that was from like inbreeding and whatever the royals did back
Scoliosis
then?
was really just a genetic thing. It travels through any sort of parent to child. It doesn't have to be the result of really anything. It's just a really bad mutation.
Yeah, but if it does pass from parent to child and they're all marrying cousins, it could be related within the family. But yeah, it's not necessarily that. But you're going to see a lot of things the week after finals week. I'll show you a few of the Habsburg monarchs, and we'll see the real effects of inbreeding. We got the Star Chamber, Henry VII, and Babylon captivity. So we went through all this about Avignon, and eventually having two popes and then one pope. So all of this was yesterday. Amazing time. Avignon's a really neat town, but I told you about getting knocked off that bridge. It's a really weird palace. Palace de Pope. Wow, is it windy here again? The wind kind of died down, but it is. I wonder if it's windy. Maybe it's just windy in my street.
Oh no, it's windy out here too. It knocked our power out about half hour ago.
Oh, you're kidding.
No.
Well, what's that?
Nope.
If your power gets knocked out or mine knocks out, if I just suddenly disappear, we know why. Okay, let's get to the crisis. A little bit more of the crisis of the church. Just a few more things we'll get to. We'll blow up Constantinople, and that will set up, literally, the Renaissance will blow up. And so, first off, we've already mentioned once before that great schism in 1054. Constantinople and Rome split apart, the Orthodox or the Eastern faith, which was in Constantinople, versus the Catholic, this bitter fight between the two over something that, looking back at it, is relatively minor, about the nature of God and the nature of Jesus. But the point is, they have been divided. They were separate. I don't know why Thomas Aquinas is so close. But with this change of thought, part of the reason I showed you that video on Day the Universe Changed on Friday is this radical change of thought was already happening. And Thomas Aquinas was a monk, sorry, I moved his head. There we go. A monk in a French monk, and what a series of writings very much influenced by Aristotle would be, we can't just or just have blind faith. So not quite this idea of hiding and just complete understanding through belief, but the idea is use reason and logic, these new ideas that are just popping up from classical works to understand faith. And the idea is don't question the faith, but try to place it in a logical place. Now, this is going to kind of blow up because of inconsistencies in not only the Bible, but also in church dogma. And so this is going to be very controversial. But at first, they're trying to hold on to this. Oh, it's really windy in the valley, too. I can see that. It's supposed to be all day. Oops. There we go. But a lot of this was a thought. Is this heresy? If you start using logic, will you start questioning? So Burke hinted at that in The Day the Universe Changed. When the Renaissance would come, wow, will this blow everything up? We're not quite done there yet. Oh, and don't forget Aristotle. So the Aristotelian vision of logic. Now, this is a bastardization of Aristotle. You know, they just kind of literally like rediscovered Aristotle in the 1100s. Like, wow, this is an amazing way to think. So the church is trying to adapt. But once you start opening the doors, there's going to be a number of movements. Southern France had a big one, but two movements we have to get to. The first one is John Wycliffe. And I love the picture is a little bit stark there. Wycliffe in England, while reading the Bible, his interpretation of the Bible, and this is going to have great impact. But look at the dates. This is during the 100 Years' War, during the plague, and something else, pre-printing press. So the information is not getting out that quick. He's in England, and he, while reading the Bible, believes that your personal relationship with God, now we're talking about the church, aka the Catholic Church, should be through your interpretation of the scripture. It's your interpretation. So this is a personal thing. This is not going to be, we must do these things the church tells me. No, I must read and learn the scripture, and that will confirm my faith. And so not the church dogma. And dogma are the practices or rituals that the Catholic Church has. And if you are a Catholic, well, all religions have a lot of dogma. But Catholic or Episcopalian, which is very close, which is the Church of England, which follows a lot of the same practices, there's a lot of ritual there. And you can't just blindly follow these rituals. You must have a personal understanding, which this kind of thinking is going to lead to, we got to learn our language, and we need some way to get this information out, and education. But he would be convicted of heresy. How dare you go against the teaching of the church, and eventually would be condemned to death. Now, he died before he could be burnt, so they dug the body up and burned it. And that picture right here is a French, this is actually by French Huguenots, which are French Protestants. It's another story for down the road. But here is Wycliffe, and that's why it shows the burning below. And he would be burned, but and this is a statue of Wycliffe in Edinburgh, and the picture I took. Wycliffe is an interesting guy, and part of his reading was, if we all have a personal faith, that means that the elite, those on top who claim to have the voice of God, are not in power, which is part of the reason why he was such a heretic to them. He's threatening the power of not only the church, but also the monarchy, who claim they get their power from God. And so his followers are going to be called the Lollards. The Lollards are going to believe not only in what Wycliffe said, but there's got to be a There's got to be, they literally called it the leveling of the classes. The upper class, the wealthy noble landlords and the monarchy and the hierarchy of the church that has all the wealth, they're going to have to give up some of what they have. And this would help trigger a peasant rebellion. Now, this peasant rebellion is not just caused by Wycliffe. Wycliffe would be more of an instigator of it, of the problems that were, his teaching would be the problems that already existed before the plague, but came out after the plague, as I mentioned before. But you could probably, and this is a picture of it, of a Lollard leading soldiers. Now, you notice how armed they were? Some were veterans of the battles of 100 Years' War, but for the most part, they were just peasants with whatever, farm implements they could fight with. Well, you can imagine what happened. I didn't type this in, but they are going to be destroyed. It's just the overwhelming force of a superior power. The hierarchy is hard to get to break down. People convinced that they're heretics and going to help lead them to hell. And what they did in the outcome of this peasant rebellion as a measure of terror to make sure that poor don't demand rights and equality and a better life, which is going to be a pretty common thing, as you've noticed throughout history. The brutal treatment of the vast majority of people who demand rights as terror so they don't do it again, to keep a tiny group on top. These are some of the pictures that happen. Their leaders will be burnt at the stake, and hundreds of their soldiers will be hung and burnt at the same time. Some of these pictures are horrific. You can find even more. The torturing, the ripping apart, the impaling, the stretching on a rack. What they did to them is actually really shocking, the brutality of the Lollards. And this is one of my favorite pictures. Here are the Lollards. So these are peasants and their leaders being burnt at the stake, yet being blessed by a bishop, right, or by a monk right there. So with that, in Bohemia, another man by the name of John Hus, he read and followed Wycliffe. Some of Wycliffe's teachings got to Hus in Bohemia. Bohemia is what we would today it's Czechia, the Czech Republic near Prague, and this would fuel his teaching and following of Wycliffe would fuel nationalism. Remember, I mentioned this before. This idea that Bohemians deserve to be independent from the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and he too would be burned at the stake for teaching faith should be a personal thing. So here are followers, and this would be a rebellion, and that's Wycliffe right there. This statue's in Prague, and it's him as the martyr, and these are bodies and people have been killed and destroyed by the Holy Roman Empire. Wycliffe is going to, or Hus is going to become a real symbol of Bohemian nationalism before and after World War I, well, actually by 1848, all the way through World War I, and the creation of a country called Czechoslovakia. Something you probably could think of, a country that was around when I was your age. And his followers would be called the Hussites, and they too would rebel, and you can imagine what's going to happen to them. This rebellion would be put down with intense brutality, burning at the stake, etc. And they claimed it was heresy, but let's be clear about it. And this was an attack on the established order. The nobility and the clergy had power they claimed from God, and therefore they had the wealth. And this was an attack against it. And these two men will be precursors to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. And there'll be a big technological, or two big changes will happen between Wycliffe and Hus and the Reformation and Martin Luther. What's the big deal? The Renaissance, the printing press. They could get the information out there. So that's this right here, though. Change of pace. Let's get to the destruction of a city. Here is Byzantium. So Byzantium is what we call, today we call the Eastern Roman Empire. They still call themselves the empire at this time of, 14th century as we're talking about here. It's emperor. They still called themselves Roman, yet also Greek. Just go with it. And we mentioned Justinian before. He had a huge amount of power. By the way, I just got a couple warnings that I'm getting bad network. If you can't hear me, I'm really sorry. I think the wind is going to be affecting us all. If I go out, but the massive Byzantine Empire, here's the empire as it was just before the Crusade. Here it's 1300. I mean, it's basically now just a tiny shadow of itself, just barely holding on. The Fourth Crusade, the Venetians basically bribed the Crusaders to surprise and attack Byzantium, Constantinople, and taking it, crushing the city. Much of the wealth was gone. It was a shadow, just barely holding on. But look at its position in the world. By holding right here, that controlled trade from Asia coming this way, an incredibly strategic position, Constantinople. That meant actually much of the trade was going through Egypt into the Mediterranean. But what an important position. So, devastated by the Fourth Crusade, as I mentioned before, they were dying poor. And by the 1400s, Genoa and Venice, city-states I'll talk more about on Friday, they were already, I'm kind of wandering around my living room. I don't like to sit and do this, and I got no board or pictures to point to. Genoa and Venice, two prominent city-states we'll talk a little bit more later about, but they had pretty much controlled the Black Sea trade, and they made relations with Constantinople, but they were becoming very rich. Here is the Hagia Sophia, or the Church of St. Sophia, the massive church built in Constantinople, kind of symbolized the greatness of the Eastern Roman Empire, but it was literally a shadow of itself. And so they controlled the trade. So Ottoman Empire was just barely hanging on. Basically, Genoa and Venice saw in their interest to keep them there so they could control the trade, because a new power was moving into what is now Turkey, the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire started, you can argue, by this man right here, Osman I, who died in 1299. This little area in black is all that the Ottoman Empire was. But they were able to take advantage, these Turks who immigrate here from this area up here. They swept in fact, they played with Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, or Muslim, whatever, or to become Muslims, whatever would help them gain power. But eventually they became Muslim states and took advantage of the weakness of the various Arab states here after the Crusades. So they grew bigger and bigger into this area here, right next to Constantinople. By the way, you see this on this map called Istanbul. That just simply means basically the city. And that's what the Ottomans will eventually call it, and that's what it's called today. But the plague changed everything. When the plague ravaged this area here, going into the 1350s and 60s, they swept into the Balkan Peninsula, which is right here. Also took a little bit of Anatolia. And they took Christian lands right here. Now, these are Christian monarchies, threatening the Holy Roman Empire up here. And they were relatively tolerant of other religions, much like the Arab invaders after their first initial charge. They would allow for Christians or Jews to practice their faith as long as they paid high taxes. They were significantly more tolerant than the Christians were. But they're a major threat to the Byzantine Empire. Major threat. I mean, they're kind of surrounding them now. And by the way, it shows it right up here to this edge. This area would be fought over and over again between Greek allies of the Byzantines and the Ottomans. But as they move in, they're going to have a lot of people convert to Islam. That's where you're going to get then a real hodgepodge of religions here. Going into the 20th century, there's going to be a huge population of Muslims, of Catholics, of various Protestants, of Orthodox Christians, and of Jews. And one of the things that the Ottomans had was they had a cadre of incredibly well-trained soldiers called the Janissaries. The Janissaries or the Janissarians, they would go into areas of Christian rule, and they recruited others, but this became a very powerful method of power for the leader of the Ottoman Empire called the Sultan. They would basically, technically they're slaves. It's a weird thing, but they would recruit young men from Christian areas. It would be kind of part of their payment, and they would become slaves to the Sultan, and through brutal and harsh training would become elite, powerful forces, and in a way kind of become kingmakers. At first they were subservient to the Sultan, but they would become so powerful, but by the 18th century, the Janissarians in many ways would run things. And here are Janissarians with arquebuses, which are early muskets. Here are Janissarians right there, colorful red uniforms, great soldiers, and would form the cadre of what's soon going to be the most fearsome fighting force of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Now, Europeans seeing this crisis would actually have a couple different crusades called the Bulgarian Crusade. And this actually happened during the 100 Years' War to stop the Ottomans. Western Europe sent a few thousand warriors. In fact, this is kind of the last little bit of the crusade. A lot of French knights who, like, I don't want to fight the British anymore, would join up to fight and stop the Ottomans in, sorry about that, I should put a map here, right here, to stop the Ottoman advance as they saw them as a real threat to pour into Central and Eastern Asia. So with that, but at the Battle of Nicopolis in the 15th or the end of the 14th century, 1389, these crusaders were routed. In fact, here shows the battle. Here are the Ottomans. Here are the Crusaders, and it was a rout. And part of the reason were just like what happened at Cressy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. It was French knights desperate to show their bravery, made suicidal charges dividing the Christian forces. And yeah, they defeated smaller forces, but ran into bigger ones and were slaughtered. And to make an example of them, the Ottomans had the prisoners butchered. And there are significantly more gruesome photos of that, the rest ransomed, partially for the brutality they showed by murdering Ottoman prisoners. But this rout of the Crusaders would lead to a besieging of Constantinople that failed, a real threat. It's actually just this amazing time. There'd be 5 total sieges of the Ottomans would try to take Constantinople. To relieve the crusade or Constantinople, the last of the all-European crusades would take place, the Crusade of Varna. So this is 36 years after Nicopolis. And this too failed north of Constantinople, but Constantinople literally by its fingertips was holding on. I should add, this was not the end of the Crusades. While this is going, the fury and the fight against the advancing power of the Ottomans, both Portugal and Spain, especially Portugal, will begin a series of crusades at this time across North Africa, and then the Spanish will take it up, the new Kingdom of Spain, in the 16th century. But 1351, Mehmed II became the new Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And there's a painting of Mehmed later on. That's an early painting. No, we'll get to him in a second. Sorry. And he decided once and for all, he's going to take Constantinople. He raised an army of 80,000 men. 10,000 were the well-trained elite Janissaries. Now, the problem with this is, for Mehmed, the army that's big has to live off the land. They can get some supplies there, but they can only fight for a small time. And this is one of the things that how Constantinople survived. I mean, it's just a shadow of itself with a tiny army. But any besieging force, they run out of food, disease ravages it, and they're forced to quit, which is what happened in 1422. And so the last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, the last Roman emperor, Constantine the 11th, a soldier. His brother was actually the king of a small little kingdom in Greece, Peloponnese. Remember Sparta? Had maybe 5 to 10,000 men. I usually see figures at 7,000, so why not 7,000? Some were well-trained forces. Some were like the equivalent of militia. They still had a cadre of a small navy. Little help, though, came from the west. A couple thousand Genoans and a few hundred French. After Varna and the Bulgarian Crusades and their own issues and the 100 Years' War and everything else, they're on their own. And they actually sent emissaries to Italy, which was not yet a country, so places like Florence and Genoa and Venice begging for help got very little. This will actually have great influence on thinking, because you have all these emissaries sent there begging to help Christianity beat off the heathens, the Ottoman heathens. And when Constantinople fell, they stayed and became things like professors at these universities and spreading thought like classics. So this is actually a big deal, but I should add the schism was still there. And so there's still a divide. So here is the Ottoman Empire. There's still other powers, but the Ottoman Empire, once this falls, is going to spread everywhere. And that's just a little finger of the Byzantine Empire. Constantine was here, his brother was here. And what happened was the Ottomans, and this is a picture of Constantinople. And here's Constantinople. And then here is, it's called Galata right here. And I'll go back. It's a Genoese trading town, walled city across. And Genoa was able to maintain neutrality, but they were indirectly helping the Byzantines. Well, Mehmed was able to put a couple forts here to make it very difficult to send reinforcements this way. He attacked Constantine's brother here, and then made a couple forts at different spots along this rank right here, along this strait right here, to isolate Constantinople and lay siege to it. And so here's Constantinople. And one of the reasons it was so powerful is look at this position. It sticks out this little peninsula surrounded by waters on 3 sides. In fact, it looks like a horn. So this water right here, this strait here, is called the Golden Horn. Massive walls protected here, and I'll show you a picture of the walls in a second. Then all the way along the seaward side are walls. The vulnerable parts would be a couple harbors here. And then right here is a massive chain to make sure that Ottoman boats can't get in here. So they can besiege them here, but it's really hard to totally destroy them. And Genoa can send supplies from Galata. Now you might say, well, why don't the Ottomans just wipe out Genoa? The Ottomans knew, Mehmed knows, if he attacks Galata, he would probably take it. But that might lead to more anger in Western Europe, more help for Constantinople. And remember, his siege can't go long because of the food situation. So much of these walls are still here. These are vulnerable spots here, but it's really hard to attack from the water, even though they would do it in a couple spots. And here's another picture of Galata. Here is the Golden Horn. Here's a picture of the Ottoman camp. You know, it's very stylized. Remember, I mentioned this before. Perspective was not a real thing. Here's elements of the chain. And it doesn't look that big in the picture, but these big bolts, so no boat can come through there. They draw it as a wall right here. But any effort to try to take the wall would be met with great force, or take the chain. And so here are the walls. And these are reconstructed section of the walls, but there are also walls that still remain there that from damage from the war, from the fight. You have an inner wall, this huge, thick, massive wall, an outer wall, so you have to go through two walls, and then this is called Paration. This is an open area here, and then a moat that has walls on it. And the reason why this open area is here is any fight, if they do get past the moat, they go in this small area where Byzantine small forces can sally out and attack the disorganized forces in this relatively small area here. So basically you have outer defenses here, defenses here, defenses here. And then this picture shows a cross section and how they have cupolas and turrets sticking out. And so men here can fire down the wall. You really see it here. Now, the problem with this wall is it's incredibly thick, but technology has changed. It doesn't matter how thick it is, cannon had arrived. And the siege began on April 6, 1453. Here's Mehmet leading the forces there, but Orban, who was what we would call today an engineer, a metallurgist, he was either a Hungarian or German, we're not sure, but he actually tried to sell his skills to the Byzantines, so they couldn't afford them. So he sold his skills to the Ottoman. You'll find out something about a lot of people in business. They claim it's for religious and fighting this holy fight for the soul of man. It's for money and power. Most people, you're surprised how many people are mercenaries and will abandon things they claim they love for money. But Orban constructed this massive piece of artillery. Eventually, it's going to have size 8 inches thick, 30 feet long. This is actually the Ottomans would make more of these down the road. So this is actually one that was used when they attacked into the Balkans 40 years later. But you can see a painting of it right here. This massive cannon. It fired a 1,500-pound stone ball. So here's a picture, a diorama of it, showing some of the stone balls and then firing it. And they tried a number of different ways to fire it. At first, they had a kind of swing on this contraption, but it was really inaccurate. So eventually they came up with a massive caisson to hold it. This had to be constructed every time they moved it. They'd have to break it apart. And one more thing about it, they would have to, after every day, they'd have to rebuild it. It would take about 30 to 40 minutes between firing. They could only fire so many times a day before it become red hot and potentially explode. But still, they use this cannon and other smaller cannon to fire at one spot and begin to chip away at the wall. So here's a cannon, and then they had other siege devices to move closer and closer. And the idea is break one section of the wall. Now the Byzantines knew this was happening, and Constantine got everybody who could move to pile up bricks and rocks and build mounds behind the wall to hold, to seal the holes. The problem was, once they began to chip away at one spot, they would continue to fire with smaller cannon that Orban would make, take the big ones down a little bit more and attack at another spot. The idea is chip away. They tried a few assaults by Janissaries, and casualties were incredibly high, but they could not breach the Byzantine defenses. Here is a picture. This is a more stylized one of them trying to climb the walls. Okay, this is done in Europe. It looked nothing like this. Here are Janissaries. This is a Janissary. This is actually a French fighter with an arquebus, and some were still using swords and pikes and halberds, but here is an arquebus. They began to carry the precursor to muskets, and they fire with a lighted match, so he's holding it right there. See the powder? It took about 2 minutes between loads, but this is a much easier to use than an arrow or crossbow, less training, and they become more important in this fight. One of the weapons the Byzantines had, as I mentioned before, was called Greek fire, and this kind of napalm flammable material that they would fire from some kind of nozzle. Here is them repelling Arab invaders. And when they would attack from the sea, here are Byzantine ships using Greek fire, fired from their bows, elaborate dragon-looking things, to beat back Ottoman ships. You can see the Hagia Sophia in the background. We're not sure what Greek fire was made out of. Some kind of incendiary. After the Ottomans would win, it kind of went away. But the Golden Horn continued to hold. And going in for a month, it looked bad for Mehmet. Disease was beginning to ravage his camp. He's running out of men. They're running out of food. And they're holding out. And so they did something absolutely amazing. Mehmet ordered his men to put boats. Now, these are all boats rowed by oarsmen, slaves. Boats, put them on wheels, and they drug them inside of the walls, drug them around here into the Golden Horn. They drug them here, and they took ships here and drug them around Galata on both ways. And there was nothing the Byzantines could do. They could see the boats going here. They could see the boats going here around Galata, but they couldn't stop them. And when that happened, all of a sudden the Ottoman fleet got here, and now they could threaten this wall. One of the things that Constantine could do is to keep his main forces here and the vulnerable areas here, and didn't really have to defend here, and still get some supplies from Galata. That cut them off. And with that, the tide turned. Oops. Sorry. Having fun watching this? And so, on May 29th, once the flank was turned, Mehmet ordered one final assault. And because of the cannon, they had broken down at two different places. The gates are the most vulnerable spots. That's an opening. Huge attacks here and here. And looking back at it, most people think that this was it. If he couldn't take it with this assault, he'd probably have to retreat. But they broke through here, got behind the line, and once that happened, the wall collapsed. The defenses there collapsed. The Byzantines were out of troops, and it just fell quickly. Here's a picture of the supposed last attack. The Janissaries broke through, and bloody fighting would take place. At least 4,000 of their 7,000 troops would be killed. 30,000 Byzantines would be enslaved. 3 days of looting and slaughter would take place. The Ottomans lost anywhere from 20 to 30,000 men. And here is I'm still trying to figure out this fight. This was done by a Greek artist. And here are the Ottomans attacking. I guess these are the Byzantine and the Ottoman princes. Almost every man was killed. Every woman would be, most women, there were probably hundreds of thousands or thousands of rapes. But most would be enslaved. Not all. Mehmet let some live because he wanted to turn Constantinople into his capital, dubbed Istanbul. Dubbed Istanbul. And Constantinople would fall. And this would be a big symbolic defeat for Christianity in the West, too. The realization hit there that this is going to change the entire power dynamic. And let me backtrack up to here. Just a sec. Let's get back to this map. Sorry. Here. By opening this up, trade can now be controlled by the Ottomans. And countries here who were fighting their own crusade right here, they begin to look for other ways to get the lucrative trade from India. So this is a big change. And you also can see on this map, once Mehmed took here, they advanced into the Balkans, advanced here, and his successors swept through all of North Africa and into Arabia, and the Ottoman Empire is going to become a mighty empire. And you'll also notice even going to the very gates of Vienna. And lastly, their banner would take the Ottoman. This is a pagan symbol of the crescent moon, and this would become their flag. And since this would become the most powerful Islamic state, to many this would become a symbol of Islam, the crescent. Crescent. Croissant. Okay, with that, I'm quitting. Tomorrow, Renaissance. We are probably going to watch. I want to do that Day the Universe Change 3. I'll decide if I want to do it Thursday or Friday. I might do it Thursday, so make sure we finish it for Friday. Make sure that you are done with chapter 10. I told you I'm going to do my plan is to do some kind of take-home test, but it's going to be very basic. The big thing is your final is going to be your project. All right. Oh, and don't forget, people at home, your people, DLI, please talk with me about sometime about turning it in, before Tuesday or Wednesday, just so I can have it. Just figure out some way to get it to me. If we have to drop it off at the front door, we'll figure it out. Just send me a note. And on that note, I will see you. Have a great day. Enjoy the wind. Goodbye.